All rise. The trial court for the County of Iron is now in session. The Honorable Richard J. Serullo presiding.
Please be seated.
Sorry, it'd be a lot closer.
Matter, People versus Cochran. Cochran is here. The attorneys are here. The jury as well. Calling for in the jury box. We are continuing with the case of the prosecution. Ms. Powell.
Your Honor, before we call our first witness, just a housekeeping matter from yesterday. People's proposed exhibit number 7 was admitted conditionally, subject to redaction. The redaction has been completed. A copy has been provided to Mr. Schulte, and I believe he is satisfied with that redaction.
I am, sir.
You are. All right. Again, 7 is received. That's redacted.
Your Honor, people call Tiffany Smith.
Smith. Morning, Ms. Smith. Would you please stand and raise your right hand and be sworn?
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
You may be seated.
Thank you. Your Honor, before I begin questioning, Mr. Schulte and I have marked as joint exhibits number 106, which is the FBI DNA lab report and worksheets. Joint exhibit number 105, which is Ms. Smith's report, and joint exhibit number 107, which is the PowerPoint of her report this matter.
Thank you. Hearing no objection. Joint exhibits 105, 06, and 07 are received.
Please state your name.
My name is Tiffany Smith.
And what is your occupation, Ms. Smith?
I'm a forensic examiner in the DNA casework unit of the FBI laboratory.
And how long have you been with the Federal Bureau of Investigation?
Since August of 2010, so for a little over 6.5 years now.
And what are your responsibilities as a forensic examiner?
As a forensic examiner, it is my job to determine which items of evidence to test in a case, to direct the testing of that evidence in the laboratory by my team of biologists, to review the results from those examinations, and then to analyze or interpret the data, write a report, and then testify if needed.
What is your experience in the field of DNA analysis, if any, prior to working at the FBI?
Prior to being hired by the FBI, I was in graduate school where I worked in a research laboratory for approximately 3 years, doing similar techniques that I perform currently at the FBI. However, I was performing those techniques myself in the laboratory, and prior to that, I was an intern at the Connecticut State Forensic Laboratory, where I observed qualified examiners performing DNA and other forensic discipline job duties.
And what is your educational background?
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in Forensic and Investigative Sciences, and I have a Master's of Science degree in Biology, both from West Virginia University.
Have you received any specialized training in the area of forensic DNA analysis since joining the FBI laboratory?
Yes, I have. Once I was hired by the FBI laboratory, I went through a rigorous 1.5-year training program where I worked alongside qualified examiners performing the same job duties I currently perform. However, it was under the direct supervision of examiners. I also worked on mock items of evidence in the laboratory so that I could understand the laboratory's protocols that the biologists follow. In addition, I went through a series of world board examinations and moot court exercises, and then took a test at the end of that training period to determine that I was in fact qualified.
Do you have any additional trainings that are not part of the mandatory training protocol, or have you had?
Every year we go through continuing education, so we stay up to date on new technologies. And like I said, this is yearly, that is put on both by the FBI lab and then also outside individuals come into the laboratory and also provide training to us.
Do you belong to any professional associations or organizations?
No, I do not.
And how long have you been doing analysis on your own cases with the FBI?
I became qualified around March of 2012, so for about 5 years.
And how many DNA analysts does the FBI have at your laboratory?
We have approximately, I would say, 10 to 12 qualified examiners, and that ranges from supervisors to more entry-level examiners. And then for the biologist role, I would say we have probably 15 or so.
And are you with the laboratory in Quantico?
Yes, I am.
Now, I believe you said this, you've been proficiency tested in the area of DNA analysis?
I have. At the FBI laboratory, we have proficiency testing, which is where we take a test by an outside organization where we do not know the results of that test. Those results are then shipped back off to the proficiency test provider in order for it to be graded, and we take 2 of those a year.
And approximately how many times or how many reports have you authored stating your conclusions regarding DNA analysis?
I have generated easily over 1,000 reports.
And have you previously testified as an expert witness regarding your findings with respect to DNA analysis?
I have.
And approximately a number of times?
I have testified approximately 25 times now.
Okay. And I'm sure some of that has been in federal court, is that correct?
Yes, most have been in federal, but some have been at the state level.
And what states have you testified in?
I have testified in North Carolina, North Dakota, Maryland, District of Columbia, Florida, New Mexico, Texas, kind of been all over the place, Idaho.
Your Honor, at this time I would tender Ms. Smith as an expert witness in the area of DNA analysis.
I'm finding that the witness's qualifications qualify her to testify by way of opinion, evidence in her field of study.
Thank you. Is your laboratory accredited, Ms. Smith?
Yes, we are.
Okay. And who are you accredited with?
We are accredited by ASCLAD Lab, which is the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors Lab Accreditation Board.
And are there standard written procedures within your laboratory that must be followed?
Yes, we do. We have protocols that are followed by the examiners in addition to the biologists.
And did you follow the procedures in this case?
Yes, I did.
What measures are taken to make sure the analysis performed and the results are reliable?
There's a series of steps that our biologists and examiners go through to ensure we are producing reliable results. The laboratory as a whole, again, is accredited. The DNA unit specifically is QAS accredited, which means that we follow quality assurance standards for forensic DNA testing laboratories. The biologists and examiners follow protocols. They're proficiency tested. The reports are reviewed to ensure that the results that are drawn are correct. And there's controls that are run with each step of the process to ensure you're getting the correct results.
Now, are there different types of DNA typing?
There are, yes.
And what are those types?
There are nuclear DNA testing that can be performed, which typically will look at STRs or short tandem repeats. These are short regions of the DNA that are repeated back to back, and that is the type of testing that I specifically conduct in the DNA casework unit. There's also other types of testing, such as mitochondrial DNA testing and other testing that also exists, but it's not currently used as often anymore.
Now, we did have a DNA analyst testify previously from the Michigan State Police Lab, and we did not discuss sex typing. What is sex typing?
Sex typing is being able to determine whether a sample is from a male or a female. And so when we perform our DNA typing, it will look at 15 different STR or short tandem repeat locations in addition to a sex determining region. Males receive an X from their mother and a Y chromosome from their father, and females receive both an X from their mother and an X from their father. Therefore, when we do our sex typing, if we see an XY, we know that there is male DNA in that sample. If we only receive an X, depending on the quality of the sample, it means it's either a female DNA profile or a inconclusive result because we cannot tell whether the Y is just missing because of the low quality of the sample.
Now, the analyst who testified earlier in this case said that Michigan State Police uses the polymerase chain reaction type of, if I'm stating that correctly, I might not be, of testing or analyzing for DNA. You guys use a different process, is that correct?
We do use PCR, or the polymerase chain reaction. That's a step in the process that is amplifying the DNA or making copies of the DNA. We use, for our statistical purposes, a technology that's semi-new, and not many state labs are currently using it. However, it is becoming more popular, and that's called StarMix.
Does your laboratory take a team approach to cases?
We do, yes.
And what does that mean?
A team approach means that we have examiners who are kind of the managers of the case. They kind of manage what will be tested, the order of the testing, but then we also have biologists who perform the different technologies in the laboratory. So for instance, if an item needs to be tested for blood or semen, we have a biologist who will perform that testing. If an item needs to be tested for DNA, we have typically multiple biologists involved with the extraction or collection of DNA from an item of evidence.
And do you have someone at your laboratory that somewhat coordinates the receipt and the disposition of the evidence on the lab's behalf?
We do. We have an evidence management group that intakes the evidence. They check to determine what was submitted to the laboratory. They determine kind of which units would be the most beneficial to the items that were submitted. They will direct the transfer of those items to the particular laboratory units, and then they will return the evidence once completed.
Do you sometimes use people outside of your particular team of examiners and biologists that have specialties in other areas to test items?
Yes, there are many units of the FBI laboratory. Evidence typically has to flow in a particular way through the laboratory to preserve the evidence for the other disciplines. So for instance, many items will first go to the trace evidence unit where they will look for hairs or fibers on those items, because once the other units begin their testing, some of those hairs and fibers could be lost. Then DNA testing will typically be done next to prevent any possible contamination from other analysts to those items. After DNA is completed, it will usually go on to the latent fingerprint unit or other units in the laboratory as the items make sense for the case.
And in this case, this may not have even flowed through you at all. There were some bones that needed to be looked at by a forensic anthropologist. Would those have come through your unit?
It depends. If the forensic anthropologist determines that they are human and there's a need to determine the DNA from those bones, they will typically come to the DNA unit. If they are determined to be non-human or the quality of the sample is too low, for instance, from heat or from exposure to the elements, then we may not process it.
Is there a separate unit for processing electronic evidence?
Yes, there are.
Now, would you characterize the amount of evidence you received in this case as a large volume of items to test?
Yes, there was a lot of items submitted to the FBI laboratory for this specific case.
And when you receive a large quantity of evidence to test, how do you decide what to test first?
So it depends on the case. Sometimes I will just review the items and do multiple rounds of testing. So for instance, I will look at the items, determine which ones I think would be the most suitable for DNA testing, and I will start with one round. Based on those results, I may submit additional items into the laboratory's biologist to have them do a second round of testing. In this case specifically, I did have a conference call with the agent involved and also the chief of police, and we determined which items would be the most suitable for testing for the first round. And then after that, I was in constant contact with Special Agent Larson to narrow down additional items to test.
How does the FBI track their evidence in cases once it arrives at the laboratory?
Each item that is received by the FBI laboratory will receive an item number, and this item number is unique for that particular item at the FBI laboratory. So it's able to be monitored and tracked throughout the lab. In addition, each case is given a unique laboratory number that only that case will have, so it can be tracked throughout the laboratory.
And in your report, I believe you listed, and there are some items missing from this list, but the numbers go all the way up to 92. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
But it was not necessarily 92 items that were tested?
That is correct. Yes, there was a subset of items that were tested, and then my report will reflect just the items that I tested at the laboratory.
Your item number 1 is a buccal sample from Christopher Carl Reagan Jr. What, if anything, did you do with that sample?
The buccal sample from Mr. Reagan Jr., that was the first item that we received at the lab. So I did have my biologist process that item for DNA in order to generate a DNA profile. Originally, it was my purpose to enter this sample into the National Missing Persons DNA database for searching against unidentified human remains in addition to other DNA profiles existing in that database. However, eventually I did receive a known from Mr. Reagan, therefore I did not need to put Mr. Reagan Jr.'s sample into the database.
And I don't know, did you talk about CODIS and what it is?
CODIS is a DNA database. It's called the Combined DNA Index System. It is a repository for DNA samples that originate from a variety of sources. So for instance, there is a subset of CODIS that holds unidentified profiles from forensic evidence. So for instance, a profile from a cigarette butt left at a crime scene, for instance, would go into that repository. There is a subset for convicted offender, arrestees, detainees. Those samples will get searched throughout that forensic index. There's also a subset for unidentified human remains. So if human remains are found and they are unidentified, a DNA profile from those remains can be obtained and entered into that database. And additionally, a subset of family member samples can be entered into the database to search against unidentified human remains.
So, by way of example, if an item was collected and a DNA profile for myself was developed, and I had committed perhaps some sort of crime way back when, and they have my DNA profile, they could take my present profile and compare it with an unidentified profile that's existing in the database?
We cannot compare specific individuals to samples in CODIS. What will happen is when, for instance, we enter forensic samples into the database, if anyone has ever been convicted of a felony or has had their DNA collected at arrest, those profiles will get entered into the database and they are searched weekly against forensic samples. And so any cases that are in the past or the future will get searched against those individuals.
And so that's only for people who have been arrested or convicted of felonies, correct?
That is correct.
I want to turn to your report now. Did you receive item number 6?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what was item number 6?
Item 6 was a rear door that was received by the FBI laboratory.
And I'm referring now to our PowerPoint. Is that item number 6 in the PowerPoint?
Yes, it is.
And what did you do with respect to item number 6?
Item 6 was first tested for blood testing, and it tested positive for the possible presence of blood. However, blood could not be confirmed on this item.
And when you say it tested positive for the possible presence of blood, what does that mean?
What that means is that it tested positive for our presumptive test. A presumptive test is a highly sensitive and highly specific test for the testing of blood samples. However, it can give false positives. It can react with other things. Our presumptive test is called Kastle-Meyer or phenolphthalein test. It is a color change test. So when an item has potentially blood on it, when that area is tested, the swab of that area will turn pink. But it can also react with rust or potentially enzymes found in particular vegetables such as horseradish can react, so therefore it cannot conclusively state that blood is on an item.
Now, we had testimony from Special Agent Larson who testified that she also uses a presumptive test out in the field. Is this similar to that presumptive test? Is this a more accurate test than what's typically used out in the field?
There are many types of presumptive tests. There are tests for when you cannot physically see any staining. You can spray an area with a chemical and it will glow under certain light conditions. There are, out in the field, our agents typically can use the same test that we use. There's also, again, many others. I wouldn't say that one's more accurate than the other. However, each one being a presumptive test can react differently with other substances that are not blood.
Now, with respect to with respect to item number 6, you indicated that the presence of blood was not confirmed. What type of test do you use to confirm the presence of blood?
We use a confirmatory test which is called the Takayama test. It is a crystal-based test. So for instance, when you take a cutting or swabbing from a blood stain and look at it under the microscope, once you add chemicals, if blood is present, you will see these red crystals forming. This test is specific for blood. However, it's not very sensitive. It does require quite a bit of sample, and it oftentimes will give a false negative result due to it not being very sensitive.
So you indicated it's not very sensitive. How do you accommodate that within the laboratory? Because you do not, of course, want to send evidence back that has a false negative.
We typically, if we get a positive result with our presumptive test, due to the fact that it is highly specific for blood and has very few false positives, usually if we get a presumptive test positive for blood, then we will still send that on for DNA testing.
Okay. With respect to testing for blood, the confirmatory test, are you testing for human blood, animal blood, or any blood?
Any blood. Our test is not human specific.
So if, for example, this had tested positive for the presence of blood, would you send it on for additional testing to determine if it was human or animal?
We would perform DNA testing, and DNA testing is human specific in the way that we get results. They're only going to react with human DNA or higher primate.
Is there any types of interference with respect to the Takayama confirmatory test?
There is no interference, however, again, the Takayama test, the confirmatory test for blood, because it uses a lot of sample, for most of the items tested in this case, I actually did not even have the biologist attempt the Takayama because there was a good chance that we would consume or use up the entire sample because of the fact that it's not very sensitive or specific. Or excuse me, it's not very sensitive, although highly specific.
Did you next test item 6.1?
Yeah, 6.1 was one of the stains on the door that tested positive for the possible presence of blood. However, blood cannot be confirmed, so that was tested for DNA.
In slide number 2 of item 107, this is just an example. What do we see in this slide?
In this slide, you see stain number 5, and that is where the biologist noted a positive reaction with our presumptive test. Our biologist will circle and number any items that have a positive result with our presumptive test so that it can be gone back and performed DNA testing later.
So going back now to item 6.1, that was a stain that was on the door, is that correct?
That is correct.
Was a swabbing prepared of that stain?
Yes, after the blood testing was complete, my biologist swabbed that stain for DNA testing.
And so the results of the blood testing did confirm the presence of blood?
There was a male DNA profile obtained. Again, it's not confirming the presence of blood. However, it did confirm that human DNA was present in that sample.
So you were able to extract DNA from the stain and it confirmed that a male donor was present. Were you able to include or exclude any donors based on this case?
Yes, I was. A single male individual was obtained from that stain. However, Ms. Cochran, Mr. Cochran, and Mr. Reagan were all excluded as a potential contributor to that stain.
You noted, I think, in this portion of the report that the sex typing results do not satisfy the DNA criteria. Oh, excuse me, that's on 6.2. What was item 6.2?
6.2 was another stain that was found on the rear door that tested positive for that presumptive test for blood. However, blood could not be confirmed. So again, that area was swabbed and sent on for DNA testing.
And were you able to extract DNA from that sample?
Yes, I was.
And what were the results when compared with the other DNA profiles of interest in this case?
There was a single individual DNA profile found on 6.2. However, I cannot tell if it was male or female due to the low quality and quantity of the DNA that was present in that sample. However, I could determine that Ms. Cochran, Mr. Cochran, and Mr. Reagan were excluded as potential contributors from that stain.
Now, this one that you said that the sex typing results did not satisfy the DNA casework, is that because of the low quantity of the sample?
Yes, so there was an X peak, which means that there was indication of the sex typing results. However, that X peak was very low, meaning it could be due to the fact that a Y peak could have been there but was missing due to the low quality of the sample, or it could have been female, but it didn't meet our criteria for determination either way.
Did you also examine items 6.3, 6.4, and 6.5?
Yes, 6.3, 6.4, and 6.5 were additional stains that were found on the rear door that tested positive for the possible presence of blood. However, blood could not be confirmed. However, no DNA or sex typing results were obtained from those 3 stains.
Was an examination performed of item 16, item 17, and item 31?
Yes, a baseball bat, a sledgehammer head, and a portion of a ramp were all tested for blood. However, no blood was detected on any of these items.
And the baseball bat is actually listed as a baseball bat from the garage. The sledgehammer is listed as a sledgehammer head from the garage. And the portion of the ramp, is that a wooden piece of material?
Yes, it was.
Item number 30, what was that item?
Item number 30 was a rabbit's foot that was found underneath a ramp, as reported by the incoming paperwork.
Your Honor, I did not have this previously marked, but I would like to introduce it. This should be it. Do you have Joint exhibit number 110?
110?
Yes. The rabbit's foot. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
Ms. Smith, I'm showing you what's been marked as joint exhibit number 110, and I'm offering it for admission at this time.
110 received.
Okay. Could you, there's some gloves there on the corner, so could you open that one, please? Could you display that to the jury, please? Thank you. Now, you indicated that you tested this item, is that correct?
Yes, I had the biologists test it. Originally, I had them just test it for DNA. However, due to the fact that there was a lot of brown staining from potential dirt on the item, I had them also test it for blood as well.
And what were the results of that testing?
The results for the blood testing was that blood was not detected on that item. And for the DNA testing, after my biologist performed the blood testing on that item, I had her swab the entire item, and no DNA or sex typing results were obtained from that item.
Is there something called degradation?
Yes, degradation is when DNA begins to break down over time. It can happen due to time, heat, weather conditions, moisture, bacteria. It's just when the DNA pieces begin to break down and it's no longer detectable with the DNA testing that's available.
Does fire also cause degradation of sample?
Yes, fire can also cause degradation of sample due to the extreme heat of the fire.
Now, did you also receive items 32, 37, 38, 39, 40, and 41 for testing?
Yes, I did.
And what were those items?
Those items were wooden planks that were found outside of the garage.
And how did you examine those?
They were tested for the presence of blood. However, blood was not detected on those items.
And again, by way of example, I'm showing on PowerPoint slide number 3. What are we looking at in that slide?
That is an example of one of the wooden planks that was tested, that did test positive, but that was not one of the ones in that grouping.
And was any DNA done on these wooden planks?
On 32, 37, 38, 39, 40, and 41, because those tested negative for the presence of blood, they were not submitted to DNA testing. Items 33, 34, 35, 36, and 42, which were additional wooden planks, did test positive for the presumptive test for blood. However, blood could not be confirmed, and those ones were sent on for DNA.
So those items were sent on for DNA. Were you able to obtain any DNA or sex typing results from those?
Each of the stains that were found on those items were sent on for DNA. All but one, no DNA or sex typing results could be obtained. From one stain that we designated as item 34-1, there was no DNA typing results. However, there was an inconclusive sex typing result, meaning there was a very small X peak, but there was no accompanying Y, so I could not tell either way if there was male or female DNA present.
Did you next test a bottle that came from a dumpster?
Yes, I did.
And what were the results of that testing?
The bottle from the dumpster was tested for blood. It tested positive for the possible presence of blood. However, blood could not be confirmed. However, when that stain was swabbed for DNA, no DNA or sex typing results were obtained.
And if blood is confirmed present, do you swab every item for DNA if it tests positive for blood?
Not always. For most cases, if there's a lot of stains on a particular item, you would typically only send one or two of those stains on for DNA testing. It's really more of a tool to find areas for potential DNA when we do the presumptive or confirmatory test. However, in this case, due to kind of the information or background of the case, I did send any areas that tested positive for that presumptive test on for DNA, knowing that a lot of these items had been outside for an extended period or were subjected to more extreme conditions. I did send everything on.
Did you next examine some swabs from the steering wheel from Chris Regan's vehicle?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what were the results of those swabs?
No DNA or sex typing results were obtained from those swabs.
Did you receive a hat to examine?
Yes, I did.
And was that item number 49?
Yes, it was described as a hat from Christopher Regan's vehicle.
And did you receive a swab also from inside the hat?
No, we received the hat and then my biologist swabbed the hat themselves. They swabbed the entire inside of the hat to perform DNA testing.
And were you able to extract some DNA from the hat?
Yes, I was.
Okay, and what did you discover, if anything?
There was a mixture of both male and female DNA from that hat, and I interpreted the DNA results from that hat as having originated from 3 individuals, meaning this was DNA from a mixture or more than one person. And a mixture is when more than one person comes in contact with an item and leaves their DNA on that item in some way, either by a body fluid or skin cells. There's a variety of reasons why your DNA could be on an item. For that hat, or the swabbing of the hat, it was determined that Mr. Regan was the source of the DNA for the major contributor on that hat. And what that means is that the DNA typing results were at least 700 billion times more likely to have originated from Mr. Regan than an unrelated unknown individual. Therefore, our threshold at the FBI laboratory is when the statistic that we calculate is greater than 700 billion, we attribute an individual as being the source of the DNA. And again, that was for the major contributor. Both Miss and Mr. Cochran were compared to that hat as well. Mr. Cochran was excluded as a potential contributor from that hat. Miss Cochran I could not exclude as a potential contributor, so I calculated the DNA. And the DNA typing results for that swabbing were at least 2 times more likely to have originated from Ms. Cochran and 2 additional individuals than 3 unknown individuals, which means that there was weak support that Ms. Cochran could be included as a potential contributor to that mixture.
I want to turn your attention now to items 56, which was a Ryobi power tool, 57, which is a plastic case, 58, which is a saw blade, 59, which is a saw blade, 60 and 61, which are saw blades, 67, which are swabs from a toolbox lid, 68, which were swabs from the toolbox bottom, 69, which were swabs from underneath the toolbox, 70, which were swabs from the tailgate, 71, which were swabs from the driver's seat, 72, which were swabs from the driver's seat belt, and 73, which were swabs from the center console. Did all of these items originate from a search warrant that was executed in Indiana on a vehicle?
For my understanding, yes.
What were the results of the testing of all of those items?
Those items were tested for the presence of blood, however, blood was not detected on any of those items.
And if there's an insufficient quantity or if the quality of the blood is degraded, would you necessarily get a positive test?
The presumptive test is only going to react if the quality and the quantity of the blood on an item is sufficient. So it's one of the limitations of the test. So you will get a negative result if there's no blood there. You'll also get a negative result potentially if the quality or the quantity of the blood is too low. That's correct.
Did you examine item number 91?
Yes, I did.
And what was item number 91?
Item number 91 was a shirt.
And I'd like to have marked at this time as item number, joint exhibit number 111, which is a blue shirt, and joint exhibit number 112, which is a pink shirt.
Are you offering them?
I am offering both of them, Your Honor, for admission.
111 and 112 received.
Ms. Smith, I'm showing you joint exhibit number 111. Could you open that for us, please, and display it to the jury? Thank you, Ms. Smith. Was that item subject to testing at your laboratory?
Yes, it was.
And for the record, the front of that t-shirt indicates what?
It has the wording, I put the pro in procrastination, or procrastinate, excuse me.
And is there a size on that shirt?
It appears to be 2XL, however, it is rubbed off quite a bit, so I can't confirm.
Okay, thank you. And you can put that back in the package, thank you. Now, what type of testing, if any, was performed on the blue shirt?
The blue shirt was first tested for the presence of blood, however, it tested negative, therefore blood was not detected on that item.
And were portions of the shirt cut for DNA extraction?
Yes, it was my understanding that the shirt possibly could have been washed since the alleged incident, and when my biologist pulled out the shirt, although it tested negative for the presence of blood, there were 2 darker areas that I was interested in still sending on for DNA testing. So 2 different areas were cut out from the shirt and sent on for DNA.
And what were the results, if any, from the first cutting from the shirt?
The first cutting had a mixture of both male and female DNA from that item. I interpreted from DNA from 3 individuals, 2 of which appeared to be both Mr. and Mrs. Cochran. The 3rd individual I compared to Mr. Reagan, and visually I could not exclude him from that item. However, when I ran my statistics for that area, it showed that the DNA typing results for that area are 4 times more likely if Mr. Reagan was not included as a potential contributor than if he was included as a potential contributor. So there was weak support that he was not included as a contributor to it.
And the second cutting of the shirt, what results, if any, were you able to obtain?
A mixture of both male and female DNA was obtained, and there was no DNA unlike both Mr. and Mrs. Cochran.
Now I'm handing you what's been marked as Joint Exhibit number 112 and has been admitted. Could you open that and display that for the jury, please? And is exhibit number 112 item 92 that you tested in your laboratory?
Yes, I did.
And for the record, that's a pink tank top?
That was correct.
Were you able to, and first of all, is there a size on the pink tank top?
I can no longer read the size due to the fading. I see LEI, but I don't see a size.
And it appears that on at least one side of the tank top there is some marker. What would that marker be attributed to?
That marker is from my biologist. So they tested this first for blood, and there was one area on the tank top that gave a positive presumptive test, meaning that the possible the possible presence of blood was positive, however, blood could not be confirmed, and so therefore my biologist circled that area and marked it with a 1 to indicate it was the first stain.
And was this item tested for DNA?
Yes, it was.
And what were the results of that testing?
Female DNA was obtained from that stain, and no DNA, unlike Miss Cochran, were found.
We have admitted your report as exhibit number 105. Of all of the items listed on there, and there were numerous items, did any of them go untested?
No, everything listed in my report was tested, and the results are in that report.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Cross-examination, Mr. Clerk.
Morning.
Good morning.
Now, I want to talk about item 6 a little bit. This is the rear door from the garage at 66 Lawrence Street. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And again, it seems, if I'm understanding this correctly, there was perhaps a presumptive test that was done on that indicated possible presence of blood, but then when things were a little bit closer, it's determined it was not blood. Did I get that right?
I wouldn't say that I could determine that it was not blood. Only the presumptive test was done because the stains were very, very small. So in order to do the confirmatory test, I would have consumed or used up that stain. So the confirmatory test was not attempted. So I cannot state whether it was in fact blood or it was not blood.
Okay. Talking about these presumptive tests, however, you mentioned some things that may cause a false positive. I think you mentioned rust. I think you mentioned horseradish, if I heard you correctly. Are there other things that may cause these false positives?
Those are the two main ones that we have found. Anything that could potentially oxidize or cause the chemical reaction can occur, but typically what we have seen is rust and that horseradish peroxidase.
And rust is the oxidation of metal, usually iron, would that be fair to say?
That is fair to say.
And we're in Iron County here, so presumably there's a lot of iron around here.
It is possible, yes.
Thank you. Now, looking at the samples that were tested, I believe from that door 6-1 and 6-2, again, I think you came back and said that it's human DNA samples that were found, but you excluded Mr. and Mrs. Cochran and Mr. Regan. Is that fair to say?
Yes, Mr. Regan and Mr. and Ms. Cochran were excluded from both the 6-1 stain and the 6-2 stain. That's correct.
And again, on the 6-1 stain, just look at my notes here, my scribbles. It's a male individual, so potentially could be any male in the world except Mr. Cochran and Mr. Regan. Would that be fair to say?
I cannot state whose DNA that is because I didn't receive any additional knowns, but I can state that it is not Mr. Regan or Mr. Cochran. That is correct.
And the 6-2 sample will come determine if it's male or female. So potentially it could be the entire human race, excluding those 3 individuals. Would that be fair to say?
It is possible. Again, I don't know whose DNA that was. That's correct.
Now, looking at the rabbit's foot here, again, you found no blood and no usable DNA on that. Is that fair to say?
That is correct, yes.
Around that time, Mr. Paul asked you a little bit about how fire would impact your findings. When you looked at that rabbit's foot, was there any indication that had been in a fire? Was there singeing on it?
I did not see any fire on the rabbit's foot or any evidence of the fire. However, it just appeared dirty, but I don't know exactly what happened to the rabbit's foot.
Okay, it was dirty, maybe broken down a little bit, but again, it wasn't any clear smell of smoke or singeing or anything like that would lead you to believe that it was put in a fire.
There's no indication of that now.
Now again, looking at the items 33, 34, 35, 36, and 42, again, the test for possible presence of blood was positive, however, you cannot confirm that. Would that be fair to say?
That's correct, yes.
And again, that was a presumptive test that was done.
That was a presumptive test. There were red-brown areas that were found by the biologist. They tested it for the presumptive test. However, again, those areas were very, very small, so therefore they were not sent on for the confirmatory test.
And these presumptive tests can be influenced by false positives, correct?
They can, again, rust or vegetable peroxidases can occur, yes.
And if what I've been told before, these other presumptive tests, they can't tell if it's human or animal blood. That would be the same for your presumptive test.
Yes, that is correct. Both the presumptive and our confirmatory tests are not human-specific. They just react with blood in general, yes.
Going back to, I'm sorry to stick around like this, but going back to 6.1 and 6.2, again, you wouldn't know the circumstances, how those DNA samples were left there, how long they've been there, why they were there. You just knew that, again, that there was something that was there that was able to be tested. Is that fair to say?
That is correct. We cannot determine how long or when a DNA sample gets deposited on an item. However, all I can say is that DNA was found and those 3 individuals were excluded. But I do not know how it got there. That is correct.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the hat that was found in Mr. Regan's vehicle, again, I think you said a mixture of DNA was found. You believe it was from 3 individuals. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And one of these people, we believe, is the source. Mr. Regan is the source of that sample. Is that fair to say?
Yes, he matched the major contributor, and due to our statistical threshold at the FBI, it was determined he was the source of the DNA. That is correct.
And again, you wouldn't know the circumstances of how he left his DNA there. You wouldn't know, again, when that happened, or what was going on, or where he was even when that was left there. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's correct.
And you could not exclude Mrs. Cochran, Kelly Cochran, as well, correct? You could not exclude her?
That is correct. I could not visually exclude her, therefore I performed my statistic.
Yeah, so not saying it is her, just saying could be her, and statistics say perhaps it's her, but can't definitively say, yeah, it's her that left that DNA there, correct?
That's correct. The way the statistic works is it compares 2 hypotheses or ideas. One is that the DNA typing results originated from a person of interest or versus the DNA typing results, the probability of the DNA typing results given that they originated from a person of interest versus an unknown individual. In this case, there was slightly more support that it was the DNA typing results originated from Ms. Cochran than an unknown person. However, that number was 2, and those numbers range anywhere from 2 to greater than 700 billion, so it was very low support.
Okay. Now again, it's for the sake of argument, say it is Ms. Cochran's DNA there. Wouldn't know the circumstances yet again. Is that fair to say?
That's correct, yes.
And the third individual, we don't know who that is, but we just know that Jason Cochran was excluded. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. Mr. Jason Cochran was excluded, yes.
Were you, and I believe, my notes don't reflect this, so I apologize if I missed this, but you do believe that it was a male sample. Is that correct, or were you able to sex that sample or not?
For the sample as a whole, it was a mixture of both male and female DNA. However, those additional contributors, I cannot determine each of those contributors what their sex was. I can just say, in general, with the mixture of DNA that was there, it was a mixture of both male and female DNA.
Okay, so that third individual could be male or female, if I heard that correctly.
That is correct.
Thank you. Now again, you looked at several items that were seized from the Cochran truck, power tool and saw blades, etc., etc. And again, none of those tested positive for the presence of blood. Is that fair to say?
That is correct, yes.
And again, and that was the official test, not the presumptive test. Is that a fair way to put that?
No, these were tested using that presumptive test, and they were all negative.
Okay, thank you. Again, and finally, looking at the 2 shirts here. The blue shirt, again, it looks like you had some male and female DNA on that. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And did that test positive for both Mr. and Mrs. Cochran?
The majority of the DNA from that shirt were consistent with having originated from Mr. and Ms. Cochran, yes.
Okay. And again, no idea how that DNA got there.
That's correct, yes.
Same for anything that would be found on that pink shirt. You wouldn't know the circumstances behind that. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Direct.
Yes, Your Honor. With respect to the hat that was taken from the vehicle, I believe your testimony was that the DNA analysis indicated that there was very weak support that Kelly Cochran was a contributor to that, correct?
Yes, the DNA results were at least 2 times more likely to have originated if Kelly Cochran was included as a potential contributor than if she was not included as a potential contributor.
However, your results indicate that Jason Cochran was definitely excluded. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I may have caused a little bit of confusion by asking the question regarding degradation of DNA by fire right after I was talking about the rabbit's foot. If an item such as a saw blade had DNA on it and that saw blade was burned, would that possibly degrade the DNA that might have been on the saw blade?
Yes, that's correct. We oftentimes, on burnt samples, it is very difficult to obtain DNA from those items.
Thank you. No further questions.
I do have one very quick question. If I were to put that hat on right now, is there any guarantee that I would leave a sufficient DNA sample in that hat?
Not necessarily, no. When you touch an item, depending on the length of the touch, the person in general, if there's a lot of sweat or if there's a body fluid being left, those would all influence how much DNA is left, but not necessarily just because you touch an item does not mean you will not leave DNA there. That is correct.
Thank you.
You may step down and you're excused and released from your seat.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Your Honor, we do require a brief technology break for a moment to see if we can get better sound for our next video teleconference.
All right, brief meeting, excusing the jury or?
You should just,
I'm sorry?
it's ready. It should be a second, just a minute.
Probably 2 minutes. That's
Stay
great.
in session. Are we having some technical problems here?
The PowerPoint screen is on, isn't showing here.
Okay, and that's all right. I advised him to have his report ready.
Okay.
You can just go ahead and sit. Okay. Can you hear us? Hello?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
A little bit of an echo.
I believe it's our courtroom. It's a very old, cavernous courtroom.
We can't hear you.
Can't really hear you very well.
Can you hear me, sir? Is that better? He's not coming through.
Can you hear me at this time?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I have a question on this?
Yes.
Dr. Serullo, before I begin your questions, I'm going to mark some exhibits and have them admitted. We're having some problems with our PowerPoint, so I'm just going to ask you at those times to refer to the report.
Okay, real quick, okay. I don't have my PhD yet. I'll be completing it later this year, so not a doctor yet.
Okay, Mr. Serullo. Your Honor,
Sorry about that.
that's okay. At this time, I'd offer to join exhibit number 108,
108's received.
which is discontaining Mr. Serullo's report. Item number 109, which is a paper copy of Mr. Serullo's report. And item 109A, which is a PowerPoint copy of Mr. Serullo's report, which of course we cannot utilize at this time. Your Honor, I only have 2 copies of the PowerPoint that I would, it's the items contained within Mr. Serullo's report. So with the court's permission, I published those to the jury so they could at least have something to reference.
All right, those 3 exhibits are received.
Thank you. Mr. Serullo, could you please state your name?
My name is John Anthony Serullo.
And what is your occupation?
Before we
I'm
get too
currently
much
employed as
further,
a forensic anthropologist at the Laboratory of Forensic Anthropology in Denton, Texas.
Mr. Serullo, can you hear me? Would you ask
Yes,
this
I
man
can.
to raise his right hand? Yes,
Would you please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Serullo, I'm going to ask you again, could you please state your name?
John Anthony Serullo.
And could you spell your last name for us, please?
Servello.
And what is your occupation, Mr. Serullo?
I am a forensic anthropologist with the Laboratory of Forensic Anthropology in Denton, Texas.
And how long have you been working as a forensic anthropologist?
I've been employed as a forensic anthropologist with the center since 2011 to present.
And when you say with the center, what center are you referring to?
The Center for Human Identification is a group that includes the molecular labs in Fort Worth as well as the anthropology lab in Denton.
And what are
Within
your,
the University of North Texas, sorry.
and what are your duties there?
My primary duties as a forensic anthropologist are going to involve the examination of human skeletal remains or remains that are badly burned or potentially remains that are badly decomposed. We will receive remains, typically from investigative agencies, medical examiners' offices, coroners, and do an initial examination or initial analysis where we do inventories and document the general condition. I'm sorry, I just had something happen on the screen. Document the general condition of the remains as they come in, photograph the remains, collect relevant information like metric data and inventory. And then once I'm done with that initial step, I'll do an examination of the remains to build biological profile, assess the remains for any evidence of trauma, look for any kind of antemortem trauma or pathology, and potentially unique identifiers that I can use to potentially tie an unidentified set of remains to a potential person of interest.
And do you work under the supervision of a board-certified forensic anthropologist?
Yes, I currently work under the direct supervision of the laboratory director, Dr. Harold Gill-King, as well as Dr. Rennie Potter-McWade, who reviewed this work. Both of them are diplomates in the American Board of Forensic Anthropology.
Now, your duties as a forensic anthropologist seem to relate directly to the identification or possible identification of remains or building as you said, a biometric profile. Are there other duties that a general forensic anthropologist might have?
One of the main things that we typically do, or one of the other things that we typically do, is to coordinate with investigative agencies and law enforcement when they contact us about cases that get submitted. And so I'm very regularly on the phone with investigators on cases that I look at. We might also need to do processing of remains if they come in with associated tissue, or if they need to be cleaned before we do our major analyses.
And when we think of forensic anthropologists, some of us think of the TV show Bones. Is that at all what you do?
That is not what I do, no. It's not, it is very fulfilling work, but I don't typically go out with my sidearm to crime scenes or chase the bad guys. It's TV. That's not what I do.
Okay. And do you have the technology available to you that they have in the TV show?
To the best of my knowledge, granted I've only watched that show a couple of times, the technology that they use in that show does not exist. At least it doesn't exist for us.
Prior to working as a forensic anthropologist, what did you do?
I was employed with the laboratory from 2007 to 2010 as a forensic anthropologist technician.
And what were your duties as a technician?
Primary duties in the technician position were to assist the other anthropologists within the lab in whatever they needed to get done for a particular case. So this would often involve intake, receipt of remains as they were shipped in, and coordinating with law enforcement or medical examiners or funeral homes on the receipt or release of remains. This might also include collecting inventory, doing photography, taking dental x-rays, helping charting, recording metric data, and in some cases processing remains if there was a fair amount of associated soft tissue on the material.
From 2000 to 2005, what was your occupation?
I was employed as a medical legal death investigator with the Travis County Medical Examiner's Office in Austin, Texas.
And what were your duties with respect to the medical legal field?
My primary function as a MEI was to act as the eyes and ears for the pathologists that were ultimately responsible for performing autopsies and certifying cause and manner of death. So in many situations this involved doing scene investigations, documenting the circumstances behind a death, last known alive time for a decedent, collecting scene information, how was the body positioned, what condition was it in, what location was it in, are there any indications of potential trauma or weapons or presence of illicit drugs, prescription drugs, that kind of material, any evidence of already known medical history. That was the major function, and I would take all of that information and synthesize it into an investigative narrative that I could provide to the pathologists. They could do their job. Along with that, I was also responsible for coordinating with law enforcement agencies and funeral homes on almost a daily basis, getting them in to the medical examiner's office on the law enforcement side to observe autopsies, as well as the intake and release of remains coming in from the funeral home. And in addition to that, I was also responsible for making sure that the next of kin were notified of the death of decedents. Oftentimes that would involve coordinating with victim services at investigating agencies, but sometimes I actually did it in person as well. Those were the major functions.
Now, do you have or have you held teaching positions in the past?
Yes, I'm currently an adjunct faculty member with Brookhaven College within the Dallas County Community College District. I teach a introduction to physical anthropology course for that school. And from 2005 to present, I've also worked within the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of North Texas as a lab instructor for multiple labs, physical anthropology, anatomy and physiology, comparative anatomy, and then I've worked as a proctor for a number of classes as well.
And what is your educational background?
I'm currently a doctoral candidate in the University of North Texas Department of Biological Sciences. I'm should be completed with my PhD by August of this year at the latest. Prior to that, I received my Master's of Biology, or Master of Science in Biology through the Department of Biological Sciences, and then in 2010, and received my Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin in 2000.
You indicated that you're a doctoral candidate and you expect that you will receive your doctorate in August. What is your concentration in with respect to your doctorate?
My primary concentrations are forensic anthropology and human anatomy.
Have you participated in other trainings that we haven't discussed yet?
When I worked at the Travis County Medical Examiner's Office, I did some medical legal training that was relevant to that job. I participated in the medical legal death investigator training course in St. Louis in 2002. And the year prior to that, did a 3-day training seminar for homicide investigators in Arlington, Texas. And then I did some additional post-baccalaureate work at Austin Community College, or in the Austin Community College District, in preparation to apply to grad school. That was mainly courses in chemistry.
Have you received any awards during your career?
Yes.
And what were those be?
Sorry, in 2008, I was awarded just a general scholarship to the Department of Biological Sciences to apply toward completing my master's degree. And in 2014 through present, I've received an additional 3 awards that have all gone toward completion of my dissertation. This was started with the 2014 GETS Instrument Award, awarded through ASD Analytical. They loaned me a piece of equipment that I needed to collect my data. In 2015, I received the Alice Cruz Award through the Mountain Desert Coastal Forensic Anthropologist Group. And just last week, I was awarded an Atlas grant through the Society of Forensic Anthropologists to apply toward completing my dissertation.
Now, previously you indicated that your work is supervised by a board-certified anthropologist or forensic anthropologist. When you prepare or offer a report with respect to remains, does the board-certified forensic anthropologist review your report or review the work performed that's documented within the report?
Absolutely. All of the reports that are generated within the lab go through a review process. And for those of us that work within the lab that are not board certified forensic anthropologists, they're going to be reviewed by one of the diplomates. So in my case, Dr. Wendy Potter-Quaid reviewed this report.
And your unit that you work with, is it sponsored or funded by a grant from the federal government?
Yes, it is. The center receives funds primarily that go toward sequencing DNA for unidentified human remains to go in CODIS. And then within that, anthropology is also funded as well, so that we're able to offer our services along with the DNA services at no cost to the agencies that are submitting them.
So is it your testimony today is not being, you're not being paid for your testimony today, correct?
What would not?
What did you say?
That would be double. No, I'm not. That would basically be double dipping. We're not being paid for this.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I'd offer Mr. Serullo as an expert in the field of forensic anthropology.
I'm accepting the witness's qualification, which would qualify him to give his testimony by way of opinion evidence in his field of expertise.
Now, Mr. Serullo, did you receive some human remains to examine on or about July 13, 2016?
Yes, I did.
And what information, if any, did you have about the case or the remains prior to receiving them?
I had no information about the case prior to them getting to the lab.
And when you do receive some remains in your laboratory, how do you start your examination?
Generally, I'll take notes on how the material arrived, give a brief description of the packaging, and then I'll unpack the remains and do a quick check to see what it is I've received, and then try and sort it out and begin my inventory process.
And what items did you receive with respect to this matter?
For these remains, I received a partial human cranium, a separate left incomplete zygomatic bone, and then multiple non-human skeletal fragments, non-human bone, and some animal scat.
And did you indicated that you received some non-human bone. Did you examine those to determine initially if they were human or non-human? Or was that not necessary? Were you able to tell just upon visual?
Oh, I'm sorry. It was visual inspection tells me, generally speaking, visual inspection tells me whether or not material is non-human. You're looking at differences in shape based on how the animal locomotes compared to the shapes that you see on human bones, especially around joint surfaces.
Was there a portion of bone that was not attached to the
Yes, the left zygomatic bone, the cheekbone, was separated from the rest of the skull, so I had to reattach that with some water-soluble glue.
And was there damage to the cranium itself?
There was a fair amount of damage on the cranium, yes.
And doctor, you had, within your report, you had some images, and if my PowerPoint's working, you may be able to look at those.
Okay. I have, oh, there we go.
Can you see that image, doctor?
Yes, I can. I'm not a doctor.
I'm
I
sorry.
appreciate that, but not yet.
If I slip up, we've been dealing a lot with experts.
I understand.
Your Honor, may I permit you to sit down so the jury can see the screen?
Yes.
I got copies of these images. That's okay.
Okay, with respect to image number 1, what are we looking at in that image?
So basically what we're looking at, I've got the zygomatic bone reattached, and it's just a standard 6 views of the skull. So if you start in the top left, we're looking at a facial view. Below that, we're looking at the second image below that is going to be the back of the skull. And on the bottom, we're looking at the base of the skull. And if you look over to the right, I've got left profile view, right profile view, and then the bottom image on the right is going to be looking down at the top of the skull.
Now, for those of us less informed, what is the zygomatic bone?
Zygomatic bones they're your cheekbones. So this portion of the bone right here, the one that was detached was the left side.
Thank you. Image number 2, what are we looking at in this image?
What we're looking at here is toward the back of the head, left side, and that somewhat circularly shaped defect is a ballistic injury wound. This is a gunshot wound. It's an entrance defect. And the red arrows are pointing at a couple of fractures that are radiating off of that ballistic defect.
And before we go on to the rest of the images, I want to return for a moment to what damage was there to the cranium that you observed during your examination?
Along with that periortem injury, there was a lot of material, a lot of the elements or the really delicate bone that you find within the nasal cavity and within the orbits, the eye sockets. If we look up in that top left picture, within the orbits, a fair amount of the bone was broken out. And a lot of the structures that are within the nasal cavity were broken out as well. If you look at the lower left image, we're looking down on the palate. The back part of the palate, going farther on the hard palate, was missing. Part of the sphenoid bone, which makes up a portion of the base of the skull right next to the palate, was also absent as well. And in the top right image, if you look at the cheekbone and you follow it back toward that little opening, a portion of the zygomatic arch is gone as well.
Are you able to tell whether those parts are missing due to scavenger activity or something else, some sort of trauma?
The damage within the orbits in the cavity can't really be directly attributed to scavenging activity. They could be related to, they could just be general postmortem damage. They could be potentially related to ballistic gas expansion. There is also the potential for an exit, but there was no obvious exit damage up there. There was no obvious exit track through the skull.
Now, you touched briefly on ballistic gas expansion. What is that?
That generally is going to happen when you have gunshot wounds that are, when the barrel is relatively close to the cranium. The ballistic gases that expand or ignite and expand to push the projectile out of the gun, when they're fairly close to the skull, will follow into the skull. And so that typically leads to a lot more damage than what you actually see here, because it has nowhere to go and cause a lot of intense fracturing.
Did you actually note some scavenger-related damage on the cranium?
Yes, there is. If you look on that lower left image, there's a large hole right there called the foramen magnum. And along the front margins of the foramen magnum, as you go back toward the palate, there was some scavenger-related damage that was there.
Was there any tissue still intact on the skull?
There was a fair amount of very dry, fibrous connective tissue. If you look on the top left image, if you look at the three images on the left and the upper right image, the left profile shot, the kind of brown colored material that you can see that's flaky on the skull is all dry fibrous tissue.
Now, do you document your inventory when you perform an examination in some manner?
Yes, I do.
And how do you document it?
Any of my inventories are going to be recorded on just a standardized inventory sheet that we use in the lab, which will have all of the elements, all the skeletal elements or the bones in the body listed with a blank next to it. And the way we'll document inventory is coding that blank as a 1, a 2, or a slash. And 1 generally means one means that the bone is present and complete, 2 means it's present but incomplete, and the slash means it's not present. So for my inventory on this case, since there was no material below the skull, all of those were entered as slashes, and on the skull you had some elements that were complete, many elements that were incomplete, so a lot of 1s and 2s.
Now, what is the term perimortem? What does that mean?
Perimortem is basically a description of at or around time of death. And so typically what we mean within forensic anthropology is that it's a traumatic defect, traumatic injury that occurred at or around the time of death. And generally speaking, it is going to be an injury that occurs or leads to the death of the individual. But it's something that happened so close to death that there's no indication of healing of that defect.
Do you have a way or a method of documenting any perimortem trauma to the skeletal remains?
I don't understand the question.
Okay, perhaps it's a poorly worded question.
No.
Do you note perimortem trauma in your report?
Oh, yes, I do.
And the next several images in your report, do those relate to perimortem trauma?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So we had discussed image number 2, and I believe you identified that as a bullet wound. Is that correct?
Correct.
And in image number 3, what are we looking at there?
On image 3, on image 3, so on that prior image, you were looking at the external view of the skull, the lower left side. Entry wound with 2 radiating fractures. Here we're looking at that same On image 3, we're looking at that same entry defect, but we're looking at it from the inside of the skull. And you've got those same 2 radiating fractures coming off of the entrance wound. We know that this is an entrance wound because when you look at the margins of that ballistic defect, you can see that it kind of cones inward toward the inside of the skull. This is called beveling, and that generally is a good indicator of direction of the projectile.
And are
So
there,
I've got, oh, sorry, go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, go ahead.
You have the 2 radiating fractures coming off of that defect, and there are 2 more. I can't see the arrows on my screen, but there's 2 additional radiating fractures down along that adjacent margin of the foramen magnum, and they should have blue arrows next to them.
They do, and are those fractures that can only be seen from the inside of the skull?
They were really only well visualized from the inside because of the scavenger-related damage on the outside.
Moving on to image number 4. What do we see in this image?
This is just a close-up view of those same 2 small fractures along the margin of the foramen magnum. You can also see that entry defect, the ballistic defect, in the lower left part of the image marked by the yellow asterisk, that large radiating fracture coming off, and then the 2 fractures along the margin.
And the large circle in that picture is the foramen magnum, is that correct?
Yes, the large circle is foramen magnum.
Now in image number 5, what do we see in this image?
5, if you go back 1 image, please.
Yes, sir.
So if we shift, basically if you shift up in front of the foramen magnum a little bit, that's the view that we're looking at. So if you go back to that image, what you're looking at is a portion of bone called the temporal petrous. This is really some of the densest bone that you're going to find within the skeleton. This is where your inner ear elements are located, structures of the inner ear. And what we're looking at is a fracture traversing the apex of that petrous.
Is that an unusual fracture for a gunshot wound case?
It's not inconsistent with, so I wouldn't say it's unusual. I would say that it requires a lot of force to fracture the petrous generally, yes.
Now moving on to image number 6, what do we see in this image?
All right, it's very faded on my screen. We're looking at an additional fracture that is crossing the temporal bone and the part of the sphenoid. So if you were to look at the side of my head, this is basically going across the right side of my head, kind of terminating up around the temple.
And in image number 7, what do we see there?
That's the same fracture crossing the temporal and a portion of the sphenoid viewed from the inside of the skull.
Image number 8, what do we observe in this image?
This is an additional fracture along the right maxilla. This is the bone that holds your upper teeth, and so this is basically coming off the right side of the nasal aperture and then terminating down around the tooth sides.
And image number 9, what do we see?
On this image, we're looking at an internal view of the skull. So I've opened the skull up, and you're looking at the front portion of the skull, so up toward the forehead. And what you're seeing is just a lot of missing bone through an area called the frontal fossa, which is the very front, and the middle fossa is that part right there in the middle.
Now, the missing bone and all of these fractures, is it your opinion that those were caused by the gunshot wound as opposed to scavenger-related activity?
You can't exclude it being related to the ballistic trauma, but there's no obvious exit defect through there.
Is there a way to determine if it's related to scavengers as opposed to the ballistic wound?
Generally speaking, if it was scavenger related, you're going to see markings left by scavengers. There were no obvious tooth markings or gnaw markings within the skull.
Now, did you next open the cranial vault?
Yes, I opened the cranial vault after I did my initial examination.
And why do you open the cranial vault?
We open the cranial vault so that we can see if there are any unexpected defects or pathologies present that we don't expect to see. And even in cases where there aren't any obvious perimortem injuries on the external surface of the skull, there are times where you can actually have trauma on the inside of the head without any visual evidence of it on the outside. The only way to really see it is to open the skull to see if it's there. So this is a standard practice that we do on all of our cases.
So when you open the skull in this case, what, if anything, did you see?
Primarily a little bit of loose soil and some plant debris that came in from wherever it was recovered.
And what did you do with that debris?
I rinsed it out. I brushed it out with a soft plastic brush and rinsed the cranial vault interior so I could get a good clean surface.
And did you observe anything within the cranial vault that you didn't expect to see? Any anomalies? I mean, difficulty pronouncing that today.
The damage that we're looking at right here in the frontal and middle fossa was documented as where the fractures located. The ballistic entry wound on the back of the skull with the radiating fractures and the fracture through the temporal petrous as well as the fractures by the foramen magnum and the other fracture that's on the right side of the skull. So those are not things you'd expect to see.
Were those consistent items, though, with respect to a skull that has a gunshot wound?
Yes.
Now, I think you mentioned twice that you were not able to tell if there's actually an exit wound. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Did you also, and once again, Dr. Mr. Serullo, why is that?
I have a dull probe that I can carefully kind of place through to see if there's an obvious exit track. And the main issues that I have with actually finding an exit track through the skull is that if you look in the middle of this image that we have up right here, there's a plate of bone that kind of sticks up into that big open space. In order for you to actually have an exit more than likely through the right orbit, that piece of bone would have to have been broken off through that exit track. So more than likely what end up, what can happen is when a bullet enters the skull, instead of it exiting, it can lose momentum and it can tumble around and potentially cause some damage, but not actually exit the bone.
Now, switching gears on you, did you also prepare post-mortem dental x-rays for Dr. Filippi in this matter?
Yes, I did.
And were those forwarded on to him for his examination?
Yes, ma'am. I sent those along with some photographs of the teeth, an occlusal view and views of the face from the facial sides for him to do his dental ID.
And what did you do with the remains upon completion of your examination?
I repackaged them into new bags, put them in a new box and sealed it, and then returned them to evidence control here in Fort Worth on the 22nd of September.
Thank you, Mr. Serullo. I have no further questions.
Mr. Shoki?
Mr. I'll be relatively brief. Board doesn't sit up here as well. I'll be close as I can to the
Go ahead.
Mr. Serullo, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, very good. This is working better than the other day. Now, it's my understanding that you looked at the hole in the back of the head and you looked at the fractures in the skull,
And that would have due to the conclusion that this was a ballistics wound. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, that is fair to say.
Now, is there any other possible injury or cause of death that would lead to the same kind of fracture, the same kind of hole in someone's head? Is there any other ways to happen other than ballistics wound?
Not that I know. This is consistent with the ballistic wound.
Okay. But again, does it tell you where this person was when they were shot? Would that be fair to say?
I really can't say one way or another where the person was. All I can say is, all I can give any kind of idea on is the relative position of the barrel of the weapon with respect to the skull. But as far as positioning of individuals, you can't get that information from the skull alone.
Even if I say where, I mean even location, if they were in a house or in a field, or if they were here or in this colony or somewhere else, you can't tell that when you're testing. Would that be fair to say?
That is fair to say, yeah.
And it doesn't tell you who pulled the trigger either. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say.
And it doesn't tell you when the trigger was pulled. Is that fair to say?
Do you mean an exact time or date?
Well, yes, I guess, yes.
No, I can't do that.
Thank you, nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Serullo. We're going to terminate this conference. Thank you for your appearance. And
Thank you, sir.
excused. All right. We're going to take our morning recess, members of the jury. You have how many more witnesses?
Your Honor, I have one short one, and then we have one that we expect will take probably the rest of the day.
All right. So we'll come back into session at close to quarter after the hour as we can get. Again, my cautions about what you can talk about, who you can talk to.
Your Honor, Mr. has a question.
Yes?
Sure. That bathroom